It's the year 1293 before Christ. You are in the city of Abydos, ancient Egypt. Admiring the beauty of the city, you enter the great temple of the pharaoh, Seti I. You look around the temple and see a young woman kneeling during a prayer. Her name is Bentrashit. As you're walking towards her, she suddenly disappears. Next time someone would see her is the year 1903, almost 3,000 years later. Her name is Dorothy Eady, and this is her story. So Dorothy Eady was born on January 8, 1904, in London. She was born in a Christian household into the most ordinary family. It didn't take long, as things already took a wild turn when she was just 3 years old. While playing, she fell down a flight of stairs and, for a moment, everyone thought she had died, including the doctor. As you probably guessed, she obviously did not die. Lo and behold, after basically being announced dead, there she was happy and lively, playing like a normal kid again, without any damage detected by the doctors. This accident is where her story starts. After this near-death experience, Dorothy started acting a bit different. She'd often cry, like all kids do, saying she wanted to go home, but when her parents asked where that was, she'd point to Egypt. You know, the place with the pyramids, pharaohs, and all that jazz. I mean, most kids want to go to Disneyland. Dorothy wanted to head to ancient Egypt. As Dorothy grew up, her fascination with Egypt, and especially ancient Egypt, only deepened. Once Dorothy and her parents paid a visit to the British Museum, wandering through the Egyptian exhibit. You already know this tickled her fancy. She'd wander around, looking at all the mummies and artifacts, saying, "These are my people. This is my home." Even going as far as kissing statues' feet and making quite the scene in the museum. Must have been one hell of a trip for the parents. Sometime after this, she started paying visits to the British Museum every chance she got, and eventually met an Egyptian, Sir Ernest Wallace Budge, who encouraged her to study hieroglyphs and helped her dive even deeper into Dorothy's interests. You could probably see it coming, but she was blazing fast at learning anything that had to do with ancient Egypt. The young girl was a true prodigy of Egyptology. All of this has been somewhat reasonable for now, but in her teens, the story of Dorothy Eady would start to escalate quite a bit more. All her life, Dorothy was a very open advocate for reincarnation. Dorothy often wrote and drew in her sleep, which is already out of the ordinary, but eventually she started to realize all her scribbles and texts told a story of her previous life. In that life, she lived in Abydos, an ancient city in Egypt, as a priestess named Bentrashit. Yep, you heard that right. She was no longer just incredibly into the subject of ancient Egypt. She was convinced she had once lived there in a way that no one could quite explain. Okay then, let's hear about Dorothy's intriguing experience as a 3,000-year-old priestess in ancient Egypt. She'd tell her family all sorts of stories about her past life. Living in the wonderful city of Abydos, her name was Bentrashit, a temple virgin who had died in young age. She lived and worked in the temple of Seti as a consecrated virgin. In an odd turn of event, she ended up in a forbidden romance with the man of the hour himself, the pharaoh, Seti I. The romance with the pharaoh took a rough turn when Bentrashit got pregnant, Seti being the father of the child. It was forbidden for a consecrated virgin to have any sexual relations, all the more with the counterpart being the pharaoh himself. After getting pregnant, she told the high priest about the identity of the father. The high priest informed her that the offense against Isis, a goddess, was so terrible, the most likely result of a trial would be the death penalty. Knowing if this information would end up to the public, the pharaoh would also get himself in quite the pickle. Shortly after talking to the high priest, she committed suicide rather than face the trial. Whoa, quite the escalation. I also wonder how it was like for the parents to hear your child was in an affair with the pharaoh of Egypt 3,000 years ago. All right, we have now learned the basic background and personality of Dorothy Eady. Let's fast forward a few years to 1931, when she had had enough of the British landscape and people, hopped on a ship and returned to her real roots, straight into the heart of Egypt, Cairo. Not long after, she was married. They would quickly have a child, naming him Seti. The couple would eventually... Hold up for a second. If my math serves me correctly, she chose her 3,000-year-old ex-boyfriend's name to be the name of her own son. Let's move on. The couple would eventually split in 1935 as her husband took a job in Iran, but Dorothy had absolutely no thoughts of leaving her true homeland. She eventually moved closer to the Giza pyramids, where she got a job from an Egyptian archaeologist, Selim Hassan. This is where Dorothy Eady would start leaving her own reincarnation-sized marks in Egypt. Let's all take deep breaths. Time for quite the Egyptology resume during Dorothy's first years of work. She was the first ever female employee of Egyptian Antiquities Service, where she totally blew everyone's mind with her knowledge of ancient Egypt. She didn't just help out folks here and there, but her insights often led to discoveries that were both historic and stunning. She started producing meaningful articles, essays, monographs, and books. Dorothy also translated hieroglyphs and documents. In a book, Excavations at Giza, she even received a special mention for all her help during the excavations. She was quickly becoming a very well-respected scholar and really making a name for herself in her field. It's probably also worthy mentioning that she did this without ever having studied in any school or institution. Quite the start to her Egyptian career, isn't it? She would keep having major impact in ancient Egyptology and built herself a pretty respectful reputation. Fast forward quite some time again, and finally, after 20 years of highly respected work, in 1956 her work came to a halt, as she finally moved to her 3,000-year-old home, Abydos. It was also in Abydos where people began calling her Seti, meaning Mother of Seti. As we move on, also keep in mind that all this time she had been more than open about her past life 3,000 years ago. So far she was considered an ancient Egyptology superwoman, but it was here in Abydos where Seti wanted to show that her reincarnation was no joke. Seti was now 52 years of age, but her reincarnation story would just keep getting better. She regularly took trips to the Temple of Seti, and during one of those trips, a chief inspector of the Antiquities Department, who knew about her claims of having lived in Abydos 3,000 years ago, and decided to test Seti to see what all her talk was really about. The chief took her to a temple she had never been at, asking her to navigate to different places inside the temple she had never seen. She was instructed to do that based on her prior knowledge as a supposed Temple Priestess. Of course, the chief was certain she couldn't do it, but you on the other side of the screen probably know better. Of course, she completed the task successfully, even though no layout of the temple had not yet been published at the time. The chief was left dumbfounded, and he even repeated this on other temples and tried different tricks to make Seti fail. But eventually he cracked and accepted the fact that Seti knew every temple like the back of her hand. Of course, the madness wouldn't stop there. Seti had often had dreams or visions about the gardens of the Temple of Seti. Those gardens were actually never discovered by anyone, but dear old Seti really fancied seeing her old garden again. Well, you already know where this is going, so I'll just say it. Of course, she just pointed at a spot, told the excavators to dig, and right there were her beloved gardens. It seemed like it wasn't just dumb luck, since moments like this actually happened plenty of times. Over the years, her reputation as the ancient Egyptology expert started to also morph into this tale of a legend whose predictions were so perfect that maybe she might have actually lived in ancient Egypt over 3,000 years ago. Just think about this. Seti was actually so good at what she did that at 60 years old, even in her lawful retirement age, she was given a special permission to just keep working. That's some badass stuff right there. She kept making inhuman archaeological discoveries, quoting her, "just by remembering." It was in 1969 she finally retired. As we near the end of the story, Seti kept working a part-time job, but as she was too brilliant at what she did, she kept on making her archaeological claims and predictions. The last notable discovery with Seti's guidance happened in 1972, when she made a claim that archaeologists would find the long-looked-after tomb of Nefertiti under the tomb of the famous pharaoh Tutankhamun's. Even though Tutankhamun's tomb was found all the way back in 1922, Seti's claim proved to be right, as in 2015, when modern technology was used to look under Tutankhamun's tomb, some experts made the discovery that there indeed was a chamber under Tutankhamun's tomb, just as Seti had speculated over 40 years before. Seti passed away in 1981, but left one quite remarkable legacy behind her. Her case is for sure one of the most convincing stories of reincarnation, and even if that part weren't true, her discoveries and help in the understanding of ancient Egyptology certainly left a mark in the field for eternity. Do you think we are looking at a real example of reincarnation, or quite literally, did Dorothy Eady just hit her head too hard as a kid, which made her an Egyptology super legend?